Good evening, everybody. First of all, apologies for Dean Godson, who many of you will have been expecting to see here this evening. Dean is held up in the Lords on the second reading of the Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Bill, but will be here possibly at some point in the next hour, possibly a bit later, but he sends his apologies. And for those who don't know who I am, I'm David Frost, Senior Fellow here at Policy Exchange. It is a huge honour for us here at Policy Exchange to welcome John Howard to our building. He needs little introduction, obviously, to anybody here. But just to cite the obvious highlights, Prime Minister of Australia, 1996-2007, famous, I think, for the many tough decisions he took in that job and subsequently, and I would just highlight three. First of all, the fact that, as is known, he and his government was a staunch ally of this country and of the United States during that period of the war on terror after 9/11, and we all remember that well. He was, I think, the author of the Pacific Solution, the Australian immigration policy that involved detaining asylum seekers elsewhere than in Australia proper. Very controversial at the time, but nevertheless a policy that has survived and has a kind of afterlife, if it is that, in our own government's Rwanda policy on the same issue. And after he was Prime Minister, he remained very active in public life, and I think I personally would single out the character reference he gave for Cardinal Pell before his acquittal on appeal, a reference which took great sort of moral authority at the time, but has been proven to be vindicated, and I think that's been characteristic of the approach he's taken to politics throughout. He has a long list of distinctions and honours. Companion of the Order of Australia, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and of course the Order of Merit, given to a very small number of people in the gift of our own sovereign. He was an open supporter of Brexit, for which many thanks. There weren't too many people around the world who supported us, and we got lots and lots of support from Australia, and we were very grateful for that. I think, without further ado, I'm going to hand over for your keynote speech, challenges facing modern conservatism, of which there are very, very many, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you.
John Howard.
Well, thank you very much, David. Can I say how pleased I am to be back, Policy Exchange, and thank you all for coming along. I especially want to acknowledge the chairman of Policy Exchange, my good friend Alexander Downer, who was Australia's longest serving foreign minister. In fact, Alexander Downer was foreign minister for the entirety of my time as Prime Minister, and I think the only time since the Federation of the Commonwealth of Australia did the same three people occupy what you call in this country the great offices of state, namely Prime Minister, Foreign Minister and Treasurer for the entirety of the government. And I think that's something that is very relevant in talking about the challenges of modern conservatism. The other person I wish to acknowledge, especially the presence of, is Michael Howard, my UK cousin in politics, and someone I have retained enormous regard for. We associated as best we could, I in government, having to observe the proprieties of dealing with an incumbent government and Prime Minister in this country of a different political stripe than myself, and Michael as an opposition leader, and it's a great pleasure to catch up with him again. I suppose the most important thing one can say about modern conservative challenges is that we don't want to be intimidated by the challenges that face us. All political movements go through periods of difficulty. It is plain for everybody to see that there has been turmoil in this country on the Conservative side of politics. There have been changes in the leadership of the government. The poll deficits, which we regularly remind ourselves of, are there for everyone to see. And of course, across the Atlantic, there is, I think, an even greater challenge facing what are loosely described as our Conservative cousins there in the Republican Party. And if one is interested in the political science as distinct from the immediate politics of the current challenges for Conservatives, it's a very interesting narrative to look at what has befallen the Republicans in the United States and compare the operation of the political system in that country with the operation of the political system of the United Kingdom and likewise of Australia and other countries that broadly follow the Westminster system of government. I think it's fair to say that one of the great advantages of a parliamentary system of government has been revealed over the past few months in those two countries. The great advantage of a parliamentary system is that it provides solutions. The solutions may not always be acceptable. The solutions may not always satisfy the devotees of a political party, but they do provide an ongoing mechanism for dealing with day-to-day problems. I look at the Republican Party in the United States, and I dealt with two American presidents, with Bill Clinton for 4.5 years and George W. Bush for 7.5 years, and I must say that although I was closer to George Bush, I found Bill Clinton an impressive man to deal with. He was thoughtful, intelligent, he was sensitive to the historically close relationship between Australia and the United States. So I don't come to what I'm about to say out of any prejudice towards Democratic Party presidents. But the problem that has been revealed in the last couple of years in the United States illustrates the weakness of a presidential system of government as distinct from a parliamentary system of government. The American Republicans are going through a suspended period of indecision, both about its direction and also its leadership. There's no such thing in the American system as a leader of the opposition. There's a minority leader in the House of Representatives, there's a minority leader in the Senate. In our system of government, and I can testify to this because I experienced it after having been voted out of government in 2007 and indeed voted out of my own seat in 2007, the Liberal Party then decided to elect, and because it had to, a new parliamentary leader. And that man, Brendan Nelson, then set about recasting the presentation of the Liberal Party to Australia. Now that doesn't happen in the American system, and you've got this phenomenon where in effect the Republican Party has been paralysed because it has a dominant figure who has continued to take all the air out of the political debate of the Republican Party. I just think that is something that we, in perhaps our moments of despondency about some of the turmoil on this side of the Atlantic, something that we should bear in mind. Now, when I think of what Conservatives in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in the United States, and indeed other countries that are broadly similar in their approach to politics, what are some of the things that modern Conservatives should pursue in common? Well, the most important thing is to see the goals of a Conservative movement, of a Conservative party, as being very much a party of values. I think Conservatives get into trouble politically when they lose sight of the fact that the thing that unites the passion of Conservative followers in the community is values. And whenever we on our side of politics lapse into thinking that the political contest is a contest of managerial competence, on our side being better than the managerial competence on the other side, I think we do ourselves a disservice. There's more to politics than managerial competence. I think one of the reasons why the Liberal Party lost office in Australia at the last election was that we thought that managerial competence was enough, that it was enough to say that the Liberal Party could always manage the Australian economy better than the Labor Party. Now, that is true. Let me say, that is profoundly true, but it's not enough, because there comes a time when the electorate tires of that and they say, well, that may be right, but they've done such a good job of managing the economy, we can risk the other crowd for a while. Now, that does happen. I don't say that lightly, and I think that's one of the reasons. I think that my party failed at the time of the last election to articulate a sufficiently broad set, based on values, of policies for the future. It's not enough to keep harking back to the past and say we can run the economy better. So I think we have to have a set of values underpinning everything we do, and we have to relate what we talk about. I mean, we talk a lot about small business, and we should always have policies that accommodate small business. But one of the reasons why we should have those policies and why we talk about small business is that our commitment to small business is based on the fundamental commitment to the value of the individual, of individual incentive, of individual initiative, and of individual encouragement. I think it's also important for Conservatives to always be the most patriotic and nationalistic party on offer. I notice that the Labor Party here has begun to display the Union flag at conferences. I find that very interesting, and I encourage it, because a flag is the most visible symbol of the unity of a country. It means that the Labor Party in the United Kingdom has perhaps woken up to that particular reality. And of course, Conservatives should always be the party of national security and the party of strong alliances. I think one of the very best things that the coalition, the Liberal government in Australia, defeated at the last election, did was to negotiate the rather clumsy sounding but nonetheless accurate AUKUS agreement between the United Kingdom, Australia and the United States, which ultimately will provide nuclear submarine capacity for my country. I thought the agreement that was made by an earlier coalition government to acquire French submarines was a mistaken arrangement, and I'm very pleased that Scott Morrison, when he was Prime Minister of Australia, jettisoned that. But can I say, from my experience in government and my experience in observing earlier governments of both political persuasions in Australia, that whenever there was a strong emphasis on national security and alliances between Australia and what I might loosely call traditional allies, such as the United Kingdom and the United States, our side of politics prospered. And I think it's a very important thing to do that. Of course, Conservatives must be parties of economic reform, just not managerial competence in the economic area. I once described, when I was Prime Minister, the process of economic reform as being like participating in a never-ending foot race. You kept striving towards the finish line. You knew that you were never going to get there because it kept receding beyond your reach, but you knew that if you stopped trying to get there, your competitors would go past you. And that is very much an expanded metaphor for the challenge that any country has economically. You have to keep striving towards achieving a greater economic reform. And because if you don't, people will go past you. There's no such thing as finally winning the argument or winning the contest when it comes to economic reform. Now, I've spoken hitherto about some of the sort of broader issues. I think there are several mechanical matters that, because they have been very much in the news recently, I want to remark about. I think one of the great challenges that all political movements have, certainly the Liberal Party has it, I imagine the Conservative Party has it, and I'm certain the Republican Party has it, is that our membership base now is probably far less representative of the people in the electorate who we aspire to gather support from than was the case 50 to 70 years ago. I think there are a greater preponderance of people involved in influencing political parties, whether they're Conservative or Labor, whose sole involvement in their working lives has been in the operation of political parties. I get a lot of people coming to see me, young men and women who say they are interested in going into politics. And do I have any advice? Well, the first piece of advice I give them is, of course, to join the Liberal Party. And having given that advice, I then say, do something unrelated to politics for 10 or 15 years before you seek to enter Parliament. Now, I don't say that critically of the many fine people who've entered the House of Commons, having worked, say, in the Conservative Research Department, or people who've entered the House of Representatives in Australia, who've worked in what I might loosely call machine politics before entering Parliament. But it is the case that our side of politics and the Labor Party side of politics in Australia is now less representative of different sections of the community than used to be the case. I often think of the very last Labor cabinet presided over by Ben Chifley, an engine driver who became Prime Minister of Australia, a Labor Prime Minister of Australia, and he was defeated by Bob Menzies in 1949, which began that long 23-year period of coalition government in Australia. Ben Chifley had an interesting cabinet. He was an engine driver. He had one lawyer, Dr. Evatt, who was the Minister of, was called External Affairs then, it's now called Foreign Affairs. He had a publican who ended up, after he left politics, of being one of Alexander's predecessors as High Commissioner for Australia in the United Kingdom. He had 2 or 3 farmers. He had a tobacconist. Now that's practically a criminal offence now, so that is not going to be repeated. And he had 1 or 2 trade union officials. The point of all of that is that the current cabinet of Mr. Anthony Albanese's Labor government. It's filled with, I'm sure, with some very capable and earnest people, but it is more heavily dominated by trade union officials and former party apparatchiks at a time when the membership of the trade union movement in Australia is vastly lower than what it was in 1949 and indeed what it was when I entered Parliament in 1974. Now, when the former Labor government in Australia was in office, it was not possible to find anybody who'd had real life rural experience to be the Minister for Primary Industries. So much so when an immediate ban on live sheep exports to Indonesia was imposed by that government as a result of a very dramatic television program. It was imposed by somebody whose father had been the most dominant trade union figure in Queensland and whose whole background had been completely unrelated to primary industry. And I focused there on the Labor Party, but the same thing can be said of the Liberal Party. When I became a junior minister in Malcolm Fraser's government in the middle 1970s, it was called a party run by farmers. And of course there were a lot of farmers. Malcolm Fraser was a grazier, the Deputy Prime Minister was a primary producer, and many of the senior ministers were. And there were also a goodly number of lawyers. And in those days it was said there were too many lawyers in Parliament. Well, that's true. It's not said anymore because there aren't. And there are now, of course, a different texture. Now, I don't want to overdo the point, but it's very important that parliaments be representative of the people, not just in this quota-driven sense, or you've got to have a certain number of women, you've got to have different ethnic groups represented to mathematical precision almost. I mean, I might say on that issue that we have a debate in Australia now about whether we should alter the Constitution to provide for what is called an Indigenous voice, the desire being to improve the quality of decision making that affects the Indigenous people of Australia. And that's a perfectly noble goal, but in the process of that debate starting, we now have 11 members of the National Parliament who identify as Indigenous Australians, and it goes right across the spectrum. Some of them are conservative and some of them are of a far leftist persuasion. So drawing that together, the point is that I think all political parties now face, I suppose, a question of representative relevance. Instead of political parties focusing on quotas of particular groups, they should focus on ensuring that their membership and therefore ultimately the people they put into Parliament reflect the diversity of occupations and the diversity of backgrounds rather than a certain percentage of women, a certain number of people of this or that ethnic background. Now they are challenges in a sense that are common to both sides of politics, but they are particularly relevant to the Conservative side of politics because we have always prided ourselves as Conservatives on being open, broadly based political parties, not beholden to outside influences and not narrowly controlled by, for example, the trade union movement. I am not pessimistic about the future of Conservative parties in our sort of countries. I know there's been turmoil, but the great thing is that Conservative parties have always been able to recover and recuperate and revive because we are, at the end of the day, parties dominated by individual spirit and individual aspiration. And that really is the essence of conservatism. It's not a belief system based on maintaining everything that we now have and rigidly setting ourselves against change. Conservatives should always embrace change if that change is going to improve society. I know terminology is difficult in this area because it varies a bit from country to country. I always have difficulty in having detailed debates of this kind with Americans because the word liberal in Australia is very different in its meaning from the word liberal in the United States. But to an audience like this, you will understand my saying that when I was leader of the Liberal Party, I described myself as an economic liberal and a social conservative. I believe very strongly in the cause of economic reform for the reason that I tried to outline. I was somebody who believed that we should preserve the things that work in Australia and shed those things that don't work. That is why when we had a constitutional referendum on whether or not to become a republic, I campaigned very strongly against that because I thought the constitutional monarchy had worked very well in Australia, and I have to say to you that one of the most enjoyable weekends of my time as Prime Minister was the weekend that referendum went down. It also coincided with the Wallabies defeating France and winning the World Cup and seeing the trophy handed by the late Queen to the captain of the Australian rugby team. But it was a very enjoyable weekend, that. But I won't get on to the last cricket test I saw in this country, but that was seeing Ben Stokes murder us in Leeds. But so, my friends, they're my thoughts. I'm an optimist about the Conservative cause, but it will only be validated if we see ourselves as people who have a set of values. Values are more enduring than specific policies. And unless you have the right values, you won't have the right policies. And if they're properly based, and very importantly, we as Conservatives should never surrender to our political parties, our political opponents rather, the ownership of some of the things that I've spoken of. A commitment to economic reform, a commitment to national security, a commitment to solidarity and defence with like-minded allies, and very importantly, a commitment to the centrality of the family as the most coherent and influential unit in our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Inspiring and fascinating, and a lot of food for thought for us. We'll open the floor to questions. There are quite a lot of people online as well, so if you're online and want to ask a question, then raise your hand and the team will try and spot you. While we're waiting for all that and to allow people a bit of thinking time, let me kick off. There's a view of conservatism here that I'm sure you're familiar with. It's become established since the Brexit referendum and since the 29 victory, in which we took a lot of Labour seats, the so-called Red Wall. And it's the view of conservatism that perhaps the Conservative Party should accept that it's got a different social base to the one it used to have, that it may be that there's more future in it being a relatively high tax, high spend party than it has been, and that it should focus on winning the culture war, being a more obviously social conservative party than it has been in the past. And so I just wonder, I mean, what do you think about that? And does it have any sort of resonance parallel from Australia?
Well, there are differences, but I think that's a completely foolish notion.
Yeah.
I really
too,
do. I think the idea that you would sort of target a particular group of seats. Look, you won, if I may say so, you won those red wall seats because you had an approach, you had a story, you had a set of policies, and I think a set of values that appealed to a majority of people across the board. I mean, we have a bit of this debate in Australia because, as you will know, at the last election, we lost a half a dozen seats that had previously been safe, conservative seats, if I can use that term, Liberal seats, to what are loosely called teal candidates. Now, teal, so I learned, is a colour, and it really, this group of people, they were all women, and some of them very talented women. I'm not making any personal criticism of them, but they were appealing to people who were cranky with us but couldn't bring themselves to vote Labor. And it was a classic sort of decoy group of candidates. And we've had debates since, oh, maybe we should just forget about those seats, winning them back, and concentrate on hanging on to or winning from the Labor Party seats in the outer suburbs of the big cities. Now that's a ridiculous proposition. Once a political party abandons other than seats that it can never win, and there are some seats in Australia we can never win, and there are some seats in this country where the Conservative Party can never win. But once you abandon pursuit of policies that appeal to people across the board, and why should a set of policies based on respect for the family unit, strong defences, economic competence, why should policies that are based on principles like that not appeal to groups of people in every electorate in the United Kingdom? And obviously there aren't enough people to whom those policies will appeal in certain parts of your country, but I think in relation to most parts of your country they do. So that's not a proposition that appeals to me, and I would hope that it is dismissed without serious consideration by Conservatives in this country. Now maybe there are some of those in this room and they will have a reason to tell me why I'm wrong, but I don't think the path back for the Liberal Party in Australia, and we are out of government, and the Conservative Party here is still in government. I don't think the path for either into the broad sunlit uplands lie in that sort of approach.
No, I completely agree with you.
Just
so there's no doubt about what I think. Let's open the floor and take a couple of comments. I think Michael Howard played first.
Thank you, and John, thank you for your inspiring remarks and for your kind words. Where would you put sound money in your pantheon of conservative values? Sound money.
Sound money? Well, I think sound money, economic competence, I'm not sure that the problem with an expression like sound money is that it sort of sounds a bit too mercenary. I think economic opportunity for all is better than sound money. I guess this is a communications thing, and maybe, I know Margaret Thatcher used the expression sound money, and I was a great fan of hers. I thought she was the best Prime Minister this country, meaning the United Kingdom, has had since Winston Churchill. But you won't be surprised to hear me say that. But I don't mind it as an expression, but I think it lacks an aspirational appeal. And the purpose of economic reform is to enlarge opportunities for individual citizens right across the board. And the way to expand the base of a political party is to recruit new members. And I think new supporters rather, it'd be nice if some of them become members as well, but it's pretty hard to get people to join anything in what is essentially now a non-joiner society. And I think we have to recognise, I mean, that's getting off the subject, but I'll come to that in a moment. But so I think, Michael, the limitation of that as a defining value is that it doesn't resonate with sufficient aspirational appeal to a lot of people. And that's just a view. And maybe it's one of those expressions that means more in this country than it does in Australia.
Interesting. I think there's a certain... I think what that debate shows is there's maybe a certain kind of grimness in some of the language that comes from the government at the moment about conservatism and the policy, and what it needs to be leavened with sort of freedom, opportunity, aspirational language if some of the fundamentals are going to appeal. Floor's open for others. Yes, gentleman at the front here, third row. There's a mic coming.
One thing that has, I think we could all agree, long been a defining value of conservatism has been common sense and stability. Now, you mentioned the politics in the United Kingdom and the United States in recent years, and I think we can all agree that it's been less than stable lately. What would you say needs to be done for this particular value to be validated once again within the conservative movements in those countries? And what do you think makes it...
I'm sorry, my hearing's not very sound. And so could you just speak into the microphone or speak up?
I'll try and speak up. I'm speaking to my
Sure.
phone. I'll try and speak up. Common sense and stability have long been considered to be defining values of conservative ideology. I'd say it's fair to say that those things have been challenged in recent years in countries like the UK and the United States. What would you say needs to happen in order for those particular defining values to be rectified, let's say? And what do you think makes those particular values distinct from similar versions of stability that's often supported by left-leaning movements in developed countries?
Look, once again, it's a question of terminology, and that will vary from people and countries and within countries, different regions. I see common sense as being a descriptor rather than a value in itself. And I think the problem with something like common sense as a standalone value is that the Labor Party can say it's common sense that you should belong to a trade union in order to advance the collective good of the employees of an individual enterprise, and we would say that if that is achieved by collective coercion and so forth, and that defies common sense. So I think it's a descriptor rather than a value in its own right.
If I could just add to that, the other word he used was ideology, and sometimes conservatives...
I think ideology has acquired an undeservedly bad name.
Yeah,
I mean, you've got to... I mean, ideology is properly, in my view, associated with Nazism and with the extremes of the last 100 years. But if you don't have some ideology, then it's very hard to produce a set of coherent values.
Yeah, I agree. This side, yes, gentleman in the blue.
Hello.
Could you introduce yourself? Sorry, I should have said.
Sorry. My name is Alex Papiano. I'm a producer. Yeah,
You're a producer
producer, yes.
of programs or
Theatre,
or
film,
goods and
TV.
services.
In the arts specifically.
Thank you.
Yeah. You mentioned ideology, mentioned the culture wars, and so on. It seems that if you're to do some kind of market analysis on this, and I mean to look out into the cultural space, it's quite clear that there are areas of conservatism that are actually thriving and doing extraordinarily well. They tend to not be in the mainstream media, they're offline. They tend to be people like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, people like this who are really galvanizing huge support. And it's all around values. It's all around the fundamental values that conservatism can offer to the individual. Now, most conservatives take this for granted, and I think we don't understand quite why Brexit resonated so strongly. We knew it was resonating. We know it resulted in the Red Wall success, but I don't think we understood why it did. Now, the idea of national conservatism, which again, in the non-mainstream media is really picking up a head of steam at the moment. Jordan Peterson has recently interviewed a key thinker in this area, whose name I will no doubt butcher, Yoran Hazone. I don't know whether you've heard of him. So anyway, he's doing the rounds now in the major non-mainstream media. Now, national conservatism, it seems, is the philosophical framework on which Brexit, Trump, and now DeSantis are moving forward. Can we learn lessons from that? Is that something we can tap into?
Well, I think we can certainly learn lessons from Brexit. I found the reaction to the Brexit vote quite extraordinary. The reaction in the mainstream media, and the reaction has continued of contempt that the mob should dare to make a decision that they saw as being in their best interests. I mean, this idea was, one of the things that really provoked me was that the reaction to the election of Donald Trump as president, and I'll add a footnote about Donald Trump at the end of this answer, the reaction to that was very similar to the reaction of many commentators to the decision of the British to vote for Brexit. I mean, as David was kind enough to point out at the beginning, although I had no vote in Brexit, I publicly, when I was asked, was rude enough to express an opinion on something that was exclusive to this country. But I thought the British made the right decision to leave the European Union. I should say the European Union has never been a friend of my country when it comes to its trading policies. It punished our highly efficient primary producers as it did the highly efficient primary producers of New Zealand. But that's another story. I think that part of the reason why people voted to leave the European Union was economic insecurity. They worried about migration. I think migration was an issue, and it would be intellectually dishonest to dispute that. I think they also objected to the steady erosion of this country's sovereignty. I do not believe that the nation state has ceased to be the organising principle for international relations. When I was Prime Minister of Australia, I worked very hard on as did Alexander Downer as Foreign Minister, on our relations with the large countries of our region, of Indonesia, of China, of Japan, of India, and the like. And I didn't see that as some kind of regional exercise. I saw it as very much improving the relations between two individual countries. You can't have a common policy, except at a very general, superficial level, between Australia and Indonesia on the one hand, and Australia and China, or Australia and India on the other. And Indonesia is our nearest neighbour. It's the largest Muslim country in the world. It has an entirely different ethnic and religious background from Australia. And it's always been a difficult relationship for Australia, but you've got to bring an exclusive set of considerations, and this idea that you can solve everything through multilateralism is absurd. And I mean, it's one of the reasons why I had reservations all along about the European Union, or the European Common Market, or the Community, as it was once called. And I think it will continue to have problems. Now, I think they ended up getting their act together and I commend them for it in relation to the Ukraine. But isn't it interesting that from the very get-go, this country was able to have a clear, identifiable position on the Ukraine ahead of many of the other countries of Europe. And I don't say that critically of countries like Germany and France. Now, it's interesting that, because it was really the first big foreign policy issue faced by the countries of Europe since Britain voted to leave. Now, do you think if we were still, or you were still part of the European Union, the distinctively and I think very commendable British position on the Ukraine would have emerged? I'm not sure it would have.
No, I agree. We'd have spent much more of our time in Brussels trying to influence the EU
well,
position
you'd have
than
spent
marking
wasted
on our own.
time.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah, exactly. You promised us a footnote on.
Beg your pardon?
You promised a footnote on President Trump.
Oh, you're going to say look,
you still want to
my
difference.
position on Trump was I thought his greatest difficulty as a president was he often lacked the public grace. Well, he did. I say that as somebody who respected and admired some of the decisions he took. I thought he achieved more in improving relations between Israel and the Arab states than any other American president in recent years. I thought his economic policies, broadly speaking, were good, and I thought he was absolutely right to call out European countries on defence spending. European countries, and I largely exclude the United Kingdom from this. I say largely have taken for granted American guarantees of security, and I thought Trump was absolutely right to call them out and say you've got to lift your game. But I thought his behaviour after he lost the election was just unacceptable. You can't play the democratic game, if I can put it that way, without accepting the outcome. It is a very accomplished opening batsman for Australia said to me at the end of last year, John, when you've been given out by the umpire and it's been upheld on the review system, you've got to leave the field. And such a metaphor would have been utterly lost on Donald Trump. But be that as it may, I think his behaviour, and I thought his personal bullying of his thoroughly decent, loyal Vice President. And it was clear that happened. And I've read a lot about this. I've read several books on that claim to be, as all books do, the true story of what happened. I thought his behaviour just has rendered him unfit to ever hold that office again.
We're going to have a go at going to our first online questioner. In my experience, there's sometimes a bit of a pause, but Patricia Hodgson is first on the list. So if she wants to unmute herself, and hopefully we will hear a question imminently.
Good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you? Can you?
We can, yes.
Good.
Yeah,
A little faintly,
but I can't, but
Ah,
anyway. You might translate.
I will do. If you could shout, Patricia, or
Right.
speak loudly, that'll probably help.
okay. Can I add to the excellent list of challenges the problem of convincing the young about representative democracy? I find the under mid-30s believe too much in experts, regulation, administrators, technocracy, In the UK, it may be because they haven't been well represented in terms of being able to buy houses, start a family and so on. But it's something broader, that in the interventionist state, there's a lack of understanding amongst the young about agency and individuals. How does Parliament convince them that they're better represented by our MPs than by regulators and administrators?
Very interesting question. I don't know how much of it you got, but the young. How do we get the young to vote for us? Do the fact that the young seem to have somewhat different attitudes on questions that are important to us. How do we deal with this?
Well, that's been a sort of social and political verity for generations. That the young have different attitudes from the middle-aged and the old, and I don't think we should throw up our arms in too much horror at that. I think democracy's had a bad experience over the last few years, but I think it's going to stage a comeback as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because people see for the first time in their lives a clear case of one country attacking another, and they don't like it. I've been impressed with the universal repulsion around the world of what Russia has done, and I think that will have an impact. I mean, I would like to see the Ukraine, I would like to see that military conflict end tomorrow, because a lot of people are dying and suffering as a result. And I doubt that it is going to honourably end tomorrow. But I do think it's presented to the whole world in very clear terms what happens when the norms that we've taken for granted between countries since, I guess, the end of World War II break down. And I think that will have an impact. I would not be surprised that if you poll the opinion of all generations in the next 12 or 18 months, you would get a bigger rap for democracy than you had 18 months ago.
Yeah, will be interesting to see. I agree. Shall we take a couple more questions? Yes, at the front here.
Hello.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, Sam Richards at Ipcrest Consultancy. Just first, might I say that I myself am a young person. I see various other young people in the room, and I think despite what is commonly portrayed, there are many young people who identify with conservative values. It's just not something that's often conveyed in the media. Secondly, to my question, I would like to ask, your speech very clearly outlined your take on conservatism today. I'd be really interested to hear if there is a particular element of conservatism that you feel needs to be different today than when you were Prime Minister of Australia, and what that element is. Thank you.
I don't think it's 15 years since I was Prime Minister of Australia, and I don't know that there's been such a dramatic shift that one thing bounces out. I mean, one of the issues that does trouble me, frankly, is the Conservative position on climate change. I have often described myself as a climate change agnostic, and I feel that I'm sliding on the subject. I'm sliding in relation to climate change, let me assure you, towards atheism, away from agnosticism. I'm not convinced that Conservatives are doing the right thing if they feel that the way to deal with this issue is to dissolve the differences between the Conservative side of politics and the non-Conservative side of politics. I'm not convinced that the world is quite on the right track on this issue. Now, I'm probably in a heavy minority in saying that in this room, and I do speak as the former Prime Minister of a country that has vast reserves of fossil fuels, and I am very conscious that in the last 30 years more people have been lifted out of poverty since the Industrial Revolution, and that's occurred in countries like China, and that economic growth in countries like China has been in large measure due, or significant measure due to the importation of high quality fossil fuels from countries like Australia. Now, I don't say that from a point of view of the selfish Australian point of view, although an Australian point of view, be it selfish or otherwise, is something that I would naturally take into account. But I mean, I think what we have to face is that if you have succeeded in countries like China and India and the like in lifting tens of millions of people out of poverty, why wouldn't you want that to keep going? And I think the world faces a situation where if the speed with which the transition is now being pursued continues, there's going to be an interruption in that poverty reduction program. And if you're talking about values, I've always thought that the great goal of human progress is to reduce human misery by improving the living standards of those who don't have a good living standard. And if we interrupt that, we've got to have a very good explanation as to why we're doing it.
I think that's the sort of climate change heresy, if I may put it as such, is something one hears a bit more of.
It's not
nowadays.
my intention to come to London and be heretical, but if you want to describe it. But look, I think we have to face it. I mean, I find a certain refusal to answer that question. I've read a lot of them. We all read a lot about this, but it doesn't seem to me that you can maintain that poverty reduction process, achieve the climate change goals to which we have all attached ourselves. I don't know how we're going to square the circle.
No, I find more people saying that than before, certainly. We've probably only got time for one more. Gentleman at the back, towards the back, in the middle. Yes, there.
Martin Ivins, ageing mainstream media journalist. While both of you gentlemen are on the platform, could I ask you to comment on former Conservative Cabinet Minister's comment on the UK-Australia trade deal? He said that in which the UK had thrown away all its cards. Could I have your views on that?
I don't know whether you saw this last week. Our former Agriculture Minister, George Eustace, rather disavowing the UK-Australia trade deal as having been far too generous to Australia as regards agriculture. I couldn't help thinking of that when you were talking about the benefits of having farmers as
well, it doesn't surprise me that somebody who saw his job as representing the interests of British farmers would express that view, and as has characterised the relationship between our two countries, I can think of an appropriately robust response. Look, it was, I think, the first of the free trade agreements negotiated between by Britain post Brexit. I thought it was a good outcome, but I think he would have been failing in what he saw as his duty if he didn't say that, but I naturally don't agree with it, and I don't think it's the least bit based on a realistic impression of the facts.
No, I rather agree. I think the big
with me,
with you, yeah. The big problem with that deal is that we didn't liberalise fast enough, in my view. But we all have a different perspectives on these things. Maybe time for one more, as we started a little late. Maybe right at the back, as I've been focused on the front.
Hi there. Question in relation to defining what conservatism is and who conservatives are. The Americans have done rather a good job of defining those who call themselves to be conservatives but aren't as rhinos. And I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions as to how we could do that in other movements that are perhaps rather less prone to labelling others.
Yeah. You want to just summarise? I didn't catch all of it.
So I think the point was, so, is the concept of the rhino, the Republican in name only? Is there a sort of parallel for us? Should we be parallel? Is that a useful way to proceed for Conservatives to try and police the boundaries, I suppose, in that way?
Well, I think it's always a bad direction for a political movement to try and prescribe its boundaries, because it gives the impression of negativity rather than an impression of positivity and aspiration. I think if the Conservative Party in the UK and the Liberal Party in Australia constantly talks about what it believes in, as distinct from what it's against or what it doesn't believe in, I think it's more successful. That would be my view. But the rhino concept that's arisen in recent years, and I think it's a product of what I said at the beginning of my remarks. I think the Republican Party has a huge identity issue because it's the mechanism of a presidential system of government does not allow the Republicans to really assert what they stand for, because they don't have a clear leadership structure. The most talked about Republican figure is Donald Trump. He holds no office, and yet he will continue to dominate. Now that's a weakness of the American presidential system that's not going to change, but it's something that has to be acknowledged. And the great virtue, if I go back to what I said at the beginning of a parliamentary system, is that it does give some structure and form and a pathway for an opposition party, and let's face it, the Republicans in the United States are an opposition party, and to assert what they believe in and what they stand for. And what I've been trying in my remarks tonight is to assert what they should stand for and what they should believe in.
Maybe that's a good note to end up on. Talk about what you believe and bring people with you rather than things that you don't. And I think let's hope we can see some of that here in the weeks and months to come. John, thank you very much for spending so much time with us. Thank you for coming to Policy Exchange.